Hello, I'm Femi OK. On the stream today, we explore hidden history finally being openly discussed. 100 years ago this week, one of the worst massacres in the history of the United States took place. During the Tulsa Race Massacre, white Americans bombed, hunted down and killed black men, women and children while burning their homes and businesses to the ground. An African-American community once so wealthy that it was described as being Black Wall Street was torn apart. The massacre was then played down to such an extent it wasn't even mentioned in history books or taught in schools for decades.
The news press has really played a large role in erasing the Tulsa Race Massacre from living memory. And it's only been in the last 25 years that historians have really started digging through some of the documents that are existing to be able to piece together what really happened. And that's why there's such wide estimates on the number of victims, and there's so few accounts existing today. In the first few years after the event, it was not written about in the newspapers here in Tulsa. And in fact, on June 1st in 1921, the Tulsa Tribune, the cover page with what is thought to be an editorial about the massacre, is entirely missing. All existing copies of the paper have that page missing, actually physically cut out. And so that sort of set the stage for how the event would then be wiped from the historical record for the following 75 years.
What do you want to know about the Tulsa Race Massacre and its impact to this very day? If you're on YouTube, you can be part of this discussion. Jump into the comments section and you can ask our guests anything. Let's meet the guests. Hello to Annalisa. Hello to Carlos. Hello, Laura. It is so good to have you on the stream on this historical week. Annalisa, in the context of the Tulsa Race Massacre, introduce yourself to our global audience.
Hello, I'm Annalisa Bruner, the great-granddaughter of Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish, Tulsa Race Massacre survivor, author of The Nation Must Awake.
Nice to see you, Annalisa. Thanks for being with us. Hello, Carlos. Tell our audience who you are.
Hi, my name is Carlos Moreno. I'm the author of The Victory of Greenwood, which tells readers about the founding of Greenwood and its historical figures up until the present day.
Good to have you, and hello, Laura. In the context of the Tulsa Race Massacre, introduce yourself to our international audience.
Hello, I'm Laura Pitter. I'm the Deputy Director of the U.S. program at Human Rights Watch, and we've authored a report called The Case for Reparations in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Good to have you, guests. Annalisa and Carlos, in order to understand what happened in Greenwood, in Tulsa, you have to appreciate what an extraordinary place it was. I am not sure if the descriptions I've seen, the pictures I've seen, have been slightly exaggerated. It was such an amazing place. Carlos, what did you know about it? What do you want to share with us about Greenwood, first of all?
Well, Greenwood was an amazing place. Booker T. Washington, the very famous historian, author, speaker at the time in 1917, did name this place the Negro Wall Street, and the name has stuck with the neighborhood ever since. It was 36 blocks of an incredible business district that had just an inspiring amount of wealth and vibrancy and joy.
Annalisa, your great-grandmother wrote an account of what happened in the Tulsa Race Massacre. Did she also talk about what Greenwood was like?
Yes, she did. She came to Tulsa from Rochester, New York, and she said that she was drawn not only by opportunities to make money, but by the sense of cooperation and community that was so strong there. There were civic organizations, churches, places where people could participate and feel the full expression of their American citizenship in freedom and in security. So these are the elements of Tulsa, Greenwood District that drove her there and others.
I mean, to be clear, this was segregated America. This is why there was a black neighborhood, and then across the train tracks, there was a white neighborhood. So if we go back to June of 1921, what started one of the worst race massacres in history, in the United States history. Carlos, you start, and then Annalisa, I want you to tell us through the eyes of your great-grandmother. Carlos, go ahead.
Yeah, Femi, I think one of the things that viewers need to understand is that this city was segregated by law. There was a housing ordinance that was passed in 1916 that said that if there was a neighborhood where white people were living, that a black family could not live there. So this segregation was structural, it was systemic in nature, and Greenwood needed to build its own neighborhood out of necessity. Yes, it was a thriving neighborhood. Yes, it was an inspiration throughout the nation. But it was a neighborhood that was built out of necessity because this black community was segregated from the rest of the city.
So what happened, Annalisa? Yeah, so I understand the segregation. We're going back 100 years here. This was segregated America. But Annalisa, what did your great-grandmother say started this race massacre?
Well, there was an underlying condition, simmering racial tensions. There was some land lust on the part of city fathers who wanted to take over Greenwood. And what we can understand from history now is that there was a precipitating event, but it was a pretext. There was a young man by the name of Dick Rowland, 19 years old, who was in an elevator downtown in the Drexel building. 17-year-old Sarah Page was the white young woman who was operating the elevator. Some event happened within the confines of the elevator. She let out a scream. The door opened. He fled, knowing the consequences of even the perception of a young black man saying something awkward to a young white woman. And so he ran. He was later arrested and taken to the jail/courthouse where there was soon after the assembly of a mob who threatened to lynch him. Black people responded, and the conflagration began. But it was a pretext. He was never fully prosecuted and found guilty of any crime. She refused to participate in any case against him. And so it was exactly a pretext for what people had wanted to do all along.
And according to some research...
Annalisa, really...
Yes, go ahead. No, Carlos, go ahead, please.
No, I really appreciate the framing of the conversation that Annalise just laid out, because it's very important to know that the story between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page was not the cause of the massacre, that this is an event that was pre-planned. The Tulsa police deputized 200 people. The National Guard supplied 2 branches, 2 divisions to evacuate the neighborhood of Greenwood. There were businessmen who supplied fuel for the airplanes that bombed this neighborhood. And so all of this, there were 3 detention camps that were set up to intern 6,000 people. So we need to understand that all of this was planned ahead of time, and all of this was done in cooperation with the city officials at the time.
And researchers believe that the young man who was in the lift with the young woman, that the lift or the elevator jerked and he accidentally bumped into her, and she panicked and started to scream. And when a white woman screams and a black man runs out of an elevator in 1921, that is never a good thing. And so when he was put into jail, a whole bunch of white locals stood outside the jail asking to lynch him. They wanted to kill him there and then. And then coming down the street were black Americans. Some of them were from World War I with guns. And then that resistance set up what you then described, Carlos. What did your great-grandmother, though, say about this, Annalisa? What did she say in her words?
I'll tell you what she said and what she saw. Her young daughter, 7 years old, was at the window. My great-grandmother had been teaching in her teaching school for typewriting and secretarial services. My grandmother, the young girl in the window, called to her mother, "Mother, I see men with guns," with a great urgency. My great-grandmother sprang to her feet and she looked out and she saw people advancing with torches, people passing by in automobiles with guns hanging out, committing drive-by shootings, actually. There were planes overhead, as Carlos has mentioned. And my grandmother, my great-grandmother, prayed to have guidance in as what you can well imagine was a life or death quandary. Should I remain in my home where I can be burned to death, or should I take my chances amongst the flying bullets outside? She thought it would be better, she says, to die in the street from bullet shot than to be subject of incendiary devices within her home. So she ran out onto the street. Someone cried out, "Get out of the street with that child, or you both will be killed." She ran north, seeking refuge at a house of a friend farther up. And we do know now that the entire quarter was surrounded. We talk about the guard and the divisions that were deployed. They surrounded the entire district, the entire quarter, so that they could slaughter people as they ran for their lives. So this was an act and a scene of warfare from above, from the street. Machine guns were mounted on Standpipe Hill, which juts out into the northern part of the city, and people were mowed down on the street as they ran.
Laura, when you're listening to this, from the vantage point of 100 years later, from a Human Rights Watch point of view, what went on there and what could be the potential accountability?
Well, so what I would just add, and it's really wonderful to be on this panel with Carlos and Annalisa, just because they've contributed, or what all the works that they're discussing are, it's important. They've made important contributions to what we know about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I would just say that what happened in 1921 was something. There were incidents of racial violence happening all over the country. The Tulsa Race Massacre was one of the worst incidents of racial violence in the history of the United States. But these events, and particularly the Tulsa Race Massacre, was precipitated by, jealousy and frustration. Whenever Black people would advance, there was this backlash, and that had been brewing, and tensions had been brewing for some time. So it was a pretext. There were many reasons why the white mob, used this moment to lash out at the Black population of Tulsa. But, 100 years later, the issue is that today we still do not have any repair or restitution for what happened. Following the massacre, the authorities did nothing to prosecute anyone for the violence that took place. No restitution was provided. The people sued to try and get the insurance claims that they had for their property and their belongings. They fought for years in courts and ultimately lost that battle. But subsequent to the massacre, authorities just tried to cover it up.
Laura, can I ask you?
100 years, and did cover it up for 100 years. So that's why we don't have justice today.
Laura, let me ask you this, because I did invite our audience to contribute to the conversation. Philandis Williams wants to ask, the insurance companies that are still around, should they be forced to pay up in current dollars the claims they refused to pay 100 years ago? Laura, thoughts?
Absolutely. There are millions of dollars, of property insured, and just because they've avoided being responsible for paying back those claims for 100 years doesn't mean that they should continue to get away with it. Yes, more information is coming to light now about what happened during the massacre in the past 20 years, particularly. But the reason it was suppressed for so long was because of intimidation and fear. And if we let intimidation and fear win out, then that certainly is not justice. And even though it's 100 years later, they're responsible, the authorities are responsible, and the insurance companies are responsible, and the city is responsible for repairing the harm that was done and providing restitution for the property and lives that were lost, absolutely as much today as they were then.
Let's go to this movement, this growing movement that is picking up some steam about reparations, accountability and justice. I want to introduce you to Viola Fletcher and also Hugh's Uncle Red Van Ellis, 2 of 3 survivors from the Tulsa Race Massacre. Here they are on May the 19th, talking about their experiences during the massacre to the House Judiciary Subcommittee. Have a listen, have a look.
I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot.
Because of the massacre, my family was driven out of our home. We were left with nothing. We were made refugees in our own country.
And Lisa, so when we're talking about reparations, we're talking about reparations for you and your family and all of your relatives as well. What would that look like?
I think that's a very important point, but more urgently, these people are over 100 years old, and we must address reparations for them, even on an emergency basis if necessary, so that they can live out their days in dignity and security, the security that was wrested from them, as Mr. Van Ellis says, making them homeless and leaving them with nothing. They also lost their sense of security and belonging. These people need to be made whole immediately with cash payments. That's my opinion, and everything else is still up for discussion. But I do, in general, support cash payment, and this as the first step toward the broader discussion of reparations in cash for enslavement.
Carlos?
Absolutely. I mean, we think of this conversation of reparations as being new, but as early as June 2nd of 1921, the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce admitted that this was a wrong that the city had done to the community of Greenwood, and that the city had a responsibility to pay reparations. And a fund was begun as early as June 2nd of 1921. It was 2 weeks later, on June 15th, that the committee was forced to resign under political pressure from the mayor and from the city commission. So here is a city who has admitted directly after this event that it owed the community of Greenwood payment to repair this damage. And here we are 100 years later, and that promise has not been fulfilled.
Laura, I'm just looking. Yeah, go ahead, Laura. Yeah, please.
I would just add to that, 20 years ago, a state-backed commission that thoroughly for 4 years investigated the massacre made recommendations that that direct payments should be made to survivors and descendants. And that was their priority recommendation. They made 3 other recommendations, but that was their first priority. 20 years later, that still has not happened. And, at the time when that recommendation was made, there were more than 100 survivors still alive. So I fully agree that at minimum, they need to provide direct payments to the living survivors that we know of today, of which only 3 remain, unfortunately. But then they need to develop a comprehensive plan, to do other things that are necessary.
And Lisa, say that one more time because you were speaking over Laura. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I did want to add one thing. I'm sorry, Laura, I didn't realize that you had not finished. Mayor Bynum of Tulsa recently said, should people today be punished for the acts of certain criminals in the past. That is a disingenuous argument. Number one, it wasn't just some random criminals. We're talking about, the city fathers themselves, people who had vested business interests and so forth in what eventually happened in Greenwood. But also, how can we think about framing the issue of making people whole as a punishment? I would invite those who would consider this a punishment to open your mind and your heart and to understand it's an opportunity to make your fellow citizens whole as you see that they are suffering and have suffered, and this is an ongoing issue. But think about looking at your neighbor, your compatriot, if you will, and thinking how you can contribute to making them whole, restoring and repairing what has happened.
My biggest challenge right now, Annalisa and Carlos and Laura, is I don't know how you put a cost on murdering over 300 people and moving them out of their neighborhood and destroying their neighborhood. I don't know how you put a financial price on that. But I do know that if you look at Tulsa right now and the people who were left in what used to be Black Wall Street, there are major issues. This is a Human Rights Watch piece about what urban renewal looks like in what was and what is now still Greenwood. Have a listen, have a look.
Urban removal, the government calls it urban renewal, I call it urban removal, came through this community like they did in so many other Black communities and literally destroyed Greenwood.
Each time, they were denied an opportunity to create some generational wealth. And so our families don't know the same generational wealth that they knew in Greenwood.
Laura, briefly, how do you put a price on the kind of loss that happened 100 years ago?
I don't think you can ever put a price on it or repair anyone with, monetary compensation, but it certainly is what can be done to try to remedy or repair to the extent that's possible today. If you're talking about, we know what property was lost, we know what insurance claims existed, and we can at least try and make people whole to the extent we can with some kind of compensation or restitution. We do it. It's good public policy, and we do it all the time when we compensate people for police violence, for example. It's not an unheard of or foreign concept. It's well established in international human rights law, and it's well established in U.S. law.
All right. I want to end up on something that, Carlos, that you have brought to our attention. The story of Greenwood is not about the massacre. It's about the resilience of the area and its comeback. Carlos.
Yeah, that is something that State Representative Don Ross said in the mid-1990s, and I fully believe it. The community of Greenwood did rebuild after this horrible event. They did so at great cost to themselves, as Laura mentioned earlier. The insurance companies would not pay, the banks would not pay, the city would not pay, and so Greenwood was really left to its own devices. And yet there is film footage from 1924 of this being a thriving community. Once again, there's film footage from 1948 to 1952 of this being a thriving community. And urban renewal comes along and builds 2 highways through the neighborhood. And so yet again, we see that 50 years later, this generational wealth that Annalisa discussed was taken away from the community once again. And so I think that also needs to be added into the conversation about reparations. And, we see the French government and German government today dealing with this issue of paying back the damage that they have done to countries that they have colonized. And so reparations have been paid by the U.S., for example, to the Japanese in internment camps. And so I think this is not without precedent.
Yeah, I hear you. Take a look here at my laptop. The Victory of Greenwood is Carlos's book. And then you can find out about Annalisa's great-grandmother, The Nation Must Awake. The details right here on my laptop. Annalisa, Carlos, Laura, YouTubers, thanks for being part of today's show. See you next time.